Thank you, Norm. Thank you all for coming out today. I think I must have given Norm an old bio for myself. Our organization changed names in January. So we used to be the Robert Schockenbach Foundation. We're now the Progress and Poverty Institute. It's important because if you like land value tax, we have a ton of resources that you can follow up with. So I'm Josie, I'm the executive director. I'm very excited to be here talking to you today about LVT, which is a fantastic value capture mechanism. How many of you have heard of land value taxes? Okay, these are my people. How many of you feel like you know them inside and out? You totally understand how they work? Okay, I see Lars's hand up. That makes sense. Still my people. This is amazing. So I talk about this policy a lot because this is one of the major focuses for my organization. Usually when I ask that first question, there's some hesitant hands that go up, not like in this room. And then when I ask the second question, no hands go up, right? So my hope and the purpose of my presentation is that if I were to ask you that second question again when I'm done talking, every hand would shoot up to the sky because you'd be like, yes, I've got this now, right? So that's the purpose of what I'm going to walk you through. But while we're still on the title slide, I want to sort of make clear, land value taxes are a form of property taxes, okay? The only difference between what most Americans are paying right now and what a land value tax would have you do is that it is shifting the tax burden onto the value of land and off of improvements. It is that simple. So we're going to spend the next 10 or so minutes unpacking that because it's just a little bit more nuanced. Okay, so I said I talk about this policy a lot, usually to people who've never heard of it. And often they look at me like, this lady has made this up. I've never heard of it before. This slide is really intended just to hit home that no, I have not made it up. From the late, great Adam Smith of The Invisible Hand all the way through the parade of economists who have won Nobel Prizes. This is a policy that is known to work. It makes economic sense. And happily, it is not aligned with either end of the political spectrum, which in today's environment feels especially important. So why do people like LVT? There are so many reasons, and I'm guessing that those of you who already really love it are going to look at the 4 I've picked and say, well, those weren't right. But I've picked these 4 because personally I think they're compelling, and because I think to an audience that's interested in community development, these are probably the most important. So the first thing I'll highlight is that land value taxes are efficient. This is economic speak for the reality that when you tax something, you get less of it. We all know this, right? This is what sin taxes are about. We don't want people to drink alcohol or smoke marijuana, and so I'm going to slap a big tax on it. We'll make revenue and we'll signal to them how to act. The problem is that when you're taxing improvements, i.e. buildings, you're getting less of them. And arguably, communities don't need less of things like homes and businesses. In fact, we need more. Land value taxes also allow property owners to keep more of what they make. So it's a fairer tax than a traditional property tax. Taxes on property are composed of 2 components, right? Land and improvements. We didn't make land, none of us make land. The value of land, in fact, derives from community. It derives from what possession or access to that land gives us in terms of jobs, public safety, schools, recreational opportunities. That value embeds in land and no individual created it. But hey, maybe I built my house, built my business. That's my own labor, right? So by untaxing the improvements, an LVT is a fairer tax than a traditional property tax. Land value taxes also discourage speculation. This is a huge one, right? Land that's being held vacant, blighted, idle is not doing anything for the community. In fact, often it's a drain on community resources. So essentially an LVT is an answer to the buy low, sell high problem. When I say problem, in most rooms, people look at me like I have 3 heads. Because why? Because we've all been raised in America to believe that to make money in real estate, you buy low and you sell high. The problem is that in order to do that effectively, you should invest as little along the way as possible. It's not good for communities. In the next slide, we'll see how LVT sort of sends the opposite signal. And the last thing that I'll mention is that LVT recognizes that location, location, location truism. We've all heard it, right? And it gets back to what I was already talking about with community assets and access to those. Well-positioned land is worth more, and so it's because of the values that the community is creating that's sort of embedding in land, and an LVT does a better job than a traditional property tax of capturing those. So here I want to put a pin in it and recognize that, yes, these are all Philadelphia graphics, right? I just did a talk on LVT in Philly last week, and I thought, hey, I like these graphics, we'll reuse them. And also, City of Brotherly Love, we can't argue with that. So here I want to go back to the basics and kind of get us all on the same page. How many of you all pay property taxes? Every single hand should go up, because whether you own property and you pay them directly or you rent, you're paying them in your rent, right? They get baked in. So let's take a second and just level set how property taxes are calculated to begin with. And yes, this is very simplified, but for our purposes, it's good enough. In a traditional property tax, which is what almost all municipalities use, save roughly 20 municipalities and school districts in the state of Pennsylvania, which do use a land value tax or a split rate tax, we're all doing this. So we have professional assessors. It's their job to assign the value to all of the improvements and all of the land in a taxing jurisdiction. They are trying to assess to market, which means that if these properties were being sold today, this is what they would sell for. They do better and worse jobs at this, and I'm going to leave it at that. That total, the sum of those two parts, is multiplied by one tax rate, and that gives the tax bill for one property. Cool. But if we're thinking about taxes, not just in terms of generating revenue, which arguably property taxes do a pretty good job of, right? They are the major local municipal funding source. About 70% on average of a municipality's budget comes from property taxes. So why fix what isn't broken? That's the expression. Well, it kind of is broken. And the reason is that taxes aren't just for generating revenue, they're actually signals for behavior. And we talked about that when we thought about tax something, get less of it. And that's exactly what happens with property taxes. You tax improvements, you get less of them. And a traditional property tax, as we can see, treats improvements just like it treats land in terms of the rate that's applied. Conversely, you do nothing with that land and your bill is going to stay really low because you don't have improvements. Okay, so this is the signal that we're currently sending to the market, and we kind of wonder why we've got all these stubborn parcels that are not being reused. I'm not going to argue it's all about property taxes. We know that would be naive, but certainly this underlying and perennial message is not helping us. So let's stop for a second and look at land value taxes. This is all it is, y'all. Again, a little bit simplified, but basically this is all it is. And it looks a lot like a traditional property tax calculation, right? We see a lot of the same components. The assessed value of improvements, the assessed value of land, we've got tax rates in there, but there's the key. Tax rates, plural, we've got two. One higher, one lower. And here's where it really the rubber meets the road. The lower tax rate is on improvements. The higher tax rate is on land. It's super critical. We are untaxing the fruits of their labor, their improvements, and we are shifting it onto the asset that they didn't create, whose value is derived from community. What happens? Well, those signals that we talked about a minute ago, they're either tamped down because your rate is lower than the rate on land, or they're negated entirely. If you shift to a full land value tax, you untax improvements. If you build something, your tax bill stays the same. It's a pretty good signal to be sending to the market. Conversely, if you do nothing, if you just hope to buy low and sell high and sit on your land, your tax bill goes way up as soon as this policy is adopted. Why? Because, first of all, we've implemented a higher rate on your land value, and we've untaxed improvements. But we have to keep it revenue neutral, right? We still need tax resources. We still need that money. We can't forego it. And so if we're untaxing improvements, we're shifting that burden onto land. So suddenly, this, which you see all over Philadelphia, if you know that city, becomes very expensive. It is an expensive proposition. People are much less likely to do this. So what happens when you adopt an LVT? And we know this is what happens because, as I said, we've had about 20 implementations in the US and a number of international implementations, which aren't really worth mentioning because when you're in the US, people really only care what's happening here. So let's look at what's happening here. So Detroit flirted with an LVT. How many of you all remember reading about that? It was in the Times. It sort of made a big splash. Okay. We'll see if it ever happens. I'm going to leave it there. But in order to understand whether it was a good idea for a city as major as Detroit, the Lincoln Land Institute funded a number of academic studies that really allowed us to pop the hood on what happens when you implement an LVT. So what happens? Infill development. Not surprising, right? You make it really expensive to hold on to land, and all of a sudden people get interested in reusing it. A reduction in sprawl. Also not surprising, right? When those prime parcels come up for development, when they're reused, there's less pressure to move outward farther and farther. It's good for the environment, it's good for the municipality. More renovations, again, unsurprising. You untax them, you get more of them. More new business starts. I think this is largely a downstream of sort of the other ones. Infill development, good properties available for businesses. I've had an idea, suddenly I can visualize it. There's foot traffic, the stars align, start that business. And the last thing I'll mention is that there tends to be a decrease in people in tax arrears. This stems from something I haven't yet mentioned, which is that an LVT is often more progressive than a traditional property tax. That means that people with more pay more, people with less pay less. And the people with less, as we know, are the most likely to get into trouble and lose their homes. So if you charge them less, it's less likely to happen. Okay, this may sound good. I hope it sounds good. But it isn't magic. It's a public policy, right? And we heard Chuck Marone talk about incremental change, right? And it got me thinking about evolution, got me thinking about studying biology, which I did many, many years ago. And we have this sort of incremental changes, which are absolutely important, and then we have these stepwise changes. And I would argue that LVT, in a way, is one of those stepwise changes. It elevates you to that next level, and then you continue to plod along towards that better future. But what do you need for it to happen? You need political will. Somebody has to get up there and say, this is important, I'm going to invest in it, I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to do the legwork. You need constitutionality, and not federal constitution, state constitution. Most state constitutions have what's called the uniformity clause. Essentially what that means, to slightly oversimplify, is that like property has to be taxed alike. This can be difficult or a hurdle when you're looking to use split rate. It doesn't make it impossible. In fact, the state of New York is currently navigating this. State of Virginia already has. It's absolutely possible. It just takes some legwork. Public outreach and education are absolutely pivotal. We saw the math, right? It looked simple, how you change from a regular tax to an LVT. The downstream, though, is that every single tax bill will change because of the changes that you're making in the math. People need to be able to understand that, foresee what's going to happen, and it's really critical that you don't just flip the switch on an LVT, that you walk it in, right, over the course of years so that people know what's coming, businesses know what's coming, and they can adjust accordingly. And then the last thing I'll mention is that you need good assessment data, and this is super critical. It sounds like a no-brainer, right? We're already taxing people on assessment data. The thing with that is that when you're using a single tax rate, you can hide a universe of sins when it comes to land valuations, right? Because you're not breaking them apart. As long as that total number you're taxing on looks like market, you're okay with a single tax rate. But when you pull those components apart and you tax them differently, it really matters that land is well assessed. So this is a hurdle in some places, including Philadelphia, where the assessments are fine to tax on with a single rate, but the wheels come off a little bit when you split it apart. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask, how many of you all feel like you understand LVT inside and out now? All right, cool, much better. Well, we can do another revisiting of this. And like I said, if you go to our website, progressofpovertyinstitute.org, lots of resources there, more forthcoming. And I know that Strong Towns is going to be assembling sort of a cheat sheet of things for you all if you want to revisit this later.
Thank you.